I'm happy to be joined by, for his first ever appearance on the show, the Attorney General of the state of Kentucky, Daniel Cameron. Daniel, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate you having me on.
Glad to do it. Daniel, I'll start with this. You've seen what's happened the last 5 or 6 nights across the country, but in Louisville specifically. In your role as Attorney General, tell me, what are your overall thoughts on the protest and the difficulty at times in Louisville, and how do you see what are your overall sort of concerns and thoughts about it?
Well, one, let me just step back and tell you how much I appreciate you having me on to talk about this issue and the role you've played in allowing this to be a forum for folks to talk about and discuss it. It's a mixed feeling as you look over the landscape over the last 4 or 5 days across the nation, and then in particular here in the Commonwealth, and more specifically Louisville. There are obviously people, obviously folks in our communities that are hurting, Black folks in particular that are hurting. And what I tried to say and convey over the last few days is that protest is something that is consistent with our country's history. And we've seen, whether it be the 60s or other periods or times, protests have been integral to our country. And so I don't have anything against folks who protest. I think it's their God-given right to be able to protest whenever the community is hurting and has concerns that they want to address or raise. On the flip side of that, I think there are some folks who have tried to hijack a peaceful protest and have tried to take advantage of the situation by stealing and destroying and vandalizing property. In my judgment, that is not the way forward with whatever concerns that are being expressed by people who are hurting in the Black community and other folks that are assisting in those protests. So I am, again, I think protests are appropriate, but I also am concerned about some of the violence that we've seen. Everyone, in my judgment, wants the truth. And when I say everyone, I mean all officials and elected leadership that are involved in the process here as it relates to Ms. Brianna Taylor or Mr. McAtee. People want the truth to come out. And so that's a part of my responsibility as the prosecuting authority in Ms. Taylor's case. And there will be others. I know Russell Coleman, the U.S. Attorney for the Western District, I think they've opened an investigation as it relates to Mr. McAtee. So I'm troubled by the things we've seen over the last few weeks and months, and there's a lot of in this country, and the leaders have to step up and figure out a way to move forward in a constructive way, to have a conversation about the things that folks in this country are hurting over, whether it be issues of race, issues of economy, or COVID-19. There are a lot of folks that are hurting, and we've seen protests here in the last few weeks and months. And
well, Daniel, I hate to cut you off because I've got a little bit of time, and your phone is a little in and out. So if there's a way, if there's anywhere you can go, no, I mean it happens, but if there's anywhere you can go that maybe get a better signal. But but let me just ask you this: your office currently has the Breonna Taylor case? I believe. I don't think you have the McAtee case. Am I correct about that?
Yeah. So let me.
That's
Tom Wine, who's the Commonwealth's attorney in Louisville, had the case initially and then moved over to our office because of a conflict concern, because he originally had indicted Mr. Walker. So we had the Breonna Taylor case, but we are still waiting for the investigation to be concluded by the Public Integrity Unit in LMPD. We are under the impression that they are going to soon wrap that investigation up, and then it'll be solely our office's case. We are working with the FBI. There is a task force that we have along with the FBI called the Kentucky Public Corruption and Civil Rights Task Force, and the FBI is looking into this along with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice to see if there are any federal issues, any federal charges that might need to be brought. And our office is looking at the state portion of this and determining what state charges should be brought in this context.
When you heard the news that the police officers in the McAtee case did not have their body cams on, what is your reaction to that news?
Well, look, I know there has been a move for more transparency within our law enforcement community. I think that was a moment in which you are sort of confounded by the fact that those cameras were not on. I think that Mayor Fisher took swift action in relieving Chief Conrad of his duties. And so I'm under the impression, or at least understand, that there might be more film footage available that might be coming out here in the next few hours. But I will, I think there is a move and effort underway across this country to have more cameras on our law enforcement officials and our officers. Look, I want to make clear that there are good officers all across this country that every day are trying to do the best job that they possibly can. And so you want to make sure that you're not passing judgment on the entire law enforcement community. But I do think it was concerning that those two body cameras were not on.
If you go back and look at the protest as a whole, Charles Booker was on earlier, talked about some of the issues that he believes they stand for. Do you agree with a lot of the protesters that there is systematic racism within the law enforcement community, or do you disagree with that complaint?
Well, I think we've got great, folks within our law enforcement community. There are always, regardless of what profession or industry that exists, there are going to be some bad apples. And so I don't want to paint with a broad brush about our law enforcement community. I have seen over the last at least 72 hours, law enforcement walking hand in hand. I mean, there are countless videos and countless photos and pictures of law enforcement owning up to, what we saw in Minneapolis, which was abhorrent in my judgment. And I think there are people across the law enforcement community that have identified that situation as something that should not have occurred by someone that was a law enforcement officer. And so, again, there will be bad apples. I'm not willing to paint with a broad brush and say that there is systemic issues. But what I want to do as a responsible member in this conversation, and I know Charles is a responsible member as well, is look for ways to work together going forward to have a constructive conversation. I know that there are other individuals, O.J. Oleka, Terrence Sullivan, others who are trying to put together groups to have constructive conversations going forward about what it looks like in this country to walk hand in hand. And I'll just say, look, my background. I think churches have an important role to play in this conversation. I know ministers here in Louisville are stepping up to the plate to be a part of this larger conversation about, at the end of the day, the conversation is how do we love our neighbors better? And that is something that I want to be a part of.
Do I think, have a unique role in this because you're an African-American who is also the head law enforcement officer, prosecuting officer in the state, and that gives you a unique role. What do you think needs to be done to help alleviate some of these concerns?
Well, I think, one of the things that we saw here recently, it was undertaken by Mayor Fisher and then Chief Conrad, was to suspend the no-knock warrants. I think that's a good sign, a good step in the right direction, in my judgment. And, I think there will be other incremental changes that will be made along the way in terms of, policing efforts. But there has to be stronger bonds, stronger linkages between our law enforcement community and our communities of color. I'm obviously happy to be a part of any of those conversations as we move forward, whether it's with Charles Booker or whether it's with Dr. Jones or whomever wants to be a part of that conversation. A good friend of mine is, I know, documenting some of the protests that are occurring. He has a heart and passion for the west end of Louisville, Lavelle White. I'm happy to sit down with him and talk about these issues as well. But this will be a community conversation. And so anything that I can do to be a part of it and bridge that gap to the extent there is one between law enforcement and our community's color, I'm happy to be there. And I know that folks within the law enforcement community want to have a constructive conversation. Every day that they wear the badge, they are there to protect and serve. And because of perceived issues and real issues, there has been a fracture in that relationship. And I think that we owe it to all of our communities of color, all of our communities, frankly, to do better to engage Black and brown communities and let them know that we're here to protect and serve them just as much as we are any other community.
A lot of folks I've heard have complained about some of the rhetoric politicians have used, and I know, you know, you're a rising star in politics and have received praise from a lot of folks, including the president. And he had the tweet that said that called the rioters thugs and said that when the looting starts, the shooting will begin. Do you think rhetoric like that is helpful, or would you say the president shouldn't say those things?
Well, look, I think here, only thing that I can control is how I represent myself and how I communicate information across the Commonwealth. The platform that I have is primarily here in Kentucky, and I try to be somebody who is responsible in the way that I convey messages. We have to be responsible and careful on this particular matter because, again, we are the prosecuting authority. I don't want to do anything to compromise the investigation as we move forward. But I think all of our elected leadership, has a responsibility to be careful in how we present our ideas to our states and to our country. Again, I think what the president was articulating were some of the things that we've seen play out across the country. Again, there are peaceful protesters, and peaceful protesters should have the ability to be able to express their views and concerns because folks are hurting in this country. And I think they have every right to do so. But the images that we've seen played out on television alongside those peaceful protesters have been folks that have been running in and out of stores, stealing goods, harming individuals, harming small businesses. Those things just can't stand in our country. And so we have to have leadership that recognizes the hurt that is felt in our communities here in this country, but also understands that there has to be the rule of law applied equally. And so that's where I stand in that delicate balance there of wanting to allow the protesters to have every right to protest, but also making sure. There is a Kroger in Louisville now that has shuttered because of some damage and stealing that has occurred in that business. That's not what we want as we move forward. We can't have small businesses afraid to be open and afraid to provide goods to particular communities because of violence that is anathema, in my judgment, to good intentions that have been conveyed by peaceful protesters. And I think the peaceful protesters, the leadership of that movement, understand that and have been trying to differentiate themselves from the violent elements. And I certainly want to do everything I can to help in that effort.
Well, Daniel, I appreciate you taking the time to come on. One of the reasons I wanted to have you on is I think it's really important for folks to realize, everybody knows where I sort of stand politically, but you and I have been friendly, and I appreciate you coming on and hopefully starting a dialogue that we can continue in the future, and I wish you the best.
Thank you, man. And again, I appreciate you giving me this platform to talk about this, and appreciate you creating this time for your viewers to listen to this conversation.